What's up, y'all? Welcome back to the Nightshade Garden. It is a wonderful time of the year back here because the tomatoes are finally large enough to let them flower and set fruit. And that means that fertilizer is top of mind. So join me as we feed some of these plants and talk about how to keep your tomatoes happy, healthy, and super productive without wasting any time or money on things you don't need. So at the time of germination, like these little melon seedlings here, seedlings don't need any supplemental fertilization because they're going to feed themselves via their seed leaves. Now, if you started your seeds in a commercial seed starting mix that is inert, it doesn't have any food in it, then you can go ahead and add either a really diluted liquid fertilizer or some compost around the time that they develop their set of first true leaves. So not that first set of false leaves that pops up, but the one after that. If you started them in potting mix like we are with these cucurbits, you probably don't need to add anything else. They've got what they need in there. So remember that tomato seedlings are going to do best if you repot them into a larger container at least once before actually transplanting them into their final home. So similarly, you're going to want to feed them probably a day or two, up to 3 days after they settle into that intermediate home for best results. Keep in mind that at that point, when the plants are still very young, it's really all about balance. You want to make sure that they're getting some food, otherwise they'll end up stunted and potentially permanently stunted, which is a bummer. But you don't actually want to feed them too much because we're not trying to encourage a ton of growth at that point when they're not actually yet receiving enough light energy to support that growth. In my experience, I've had the best results starting the seeds into a sifted potting mix that already contains a mild fertilizer. And then when I pot them up, I do it into a mix that contains a lot of compost and worm castings. And I found that that kind of takes a lot of the guesswork out of it for me. Oh, hey, by the way, I do have some pretty in-depth videos on tomato seed starting as well as tomato potting up. If you are interested, I will link those in the description. Tell you what, I kind of feel like a low-budget Zach Galifianakis between two ferns here. I don't know. What do you think? Does between two tomato plants have the same ring to it? Give it a shot. Okay, let's talk real quick about preparing your soil ahead of time. Now, this step is called pre-plant fertilization. I'm just gonna skip right to the punchline and say, I don't actually recommend adding any concentrated NPK fertilizers ahead of the point of where you're actually putting the plants into the ground. Now, I'm gonna get into the biology of why that is here in a second, but for now, just focus on making sure that you are amending that soil with lots of organics, using things like compost and aged manure, trying to build soil that is moderately acidic if you're able to, using things like sphagnum peat moss or elemental sulfur, and that you are building soil that is at least well draining, because tomatoes, like most nightshades really, are susceptible to root rot when there's too much moisture surrounding their roots. They just really don't like to have wet roots. And hey, if you are like me and your native soil is really, really heavy in clay and terrible drainage, just really good stuff, right? No, it's horrible. Or maybe your soil is terrible in some other way. There are so many unique ways to have bad soil. Do not give up. You can probably still grow tomatoes. Let's take a look. All of our tomatoes up here, including this beautiful yellow pear, were planted into a mixture of native clay soil and compost and aged steer manure. A lot of these were actually planted in as much as 2/3 clay soil. And yeah, while they're probably not going to win any prizes, they are well on their way to giving us a really nice harvest, and all for about 50 cents in amendments. If you do choose to add a fertilizer well ahead of transplant day when you're preparing that soil, just make sure that it's something that's not going to get just washed away before the plants are ever in the ground. A slow release granular fertilizer, for instance, is actually going to be available when your plants need it. All right, so after you've got your soil prepped ahead of time, it's time to start thinking about fertilization at the point of transplant. If you're willing to run a soil test, that'll really help you dial in and make a more specific fertilization plan and schedule. But like practically speaking, most of us probably aren't going to do that, or at least not every year. So we're just going to go through fertilization recommendations that are good for the majority of use cases in the majority of soil types. At or around transplant days, when we want to start mixing in either a balanced fertilizer, something like 10-10-10 mix, or a fertilizer that's maybe a little bit lower in nitrogen, very high in phosphorus, very low in potassium, all the way up to something like a 10-34-0, which I don't have on hand. If you did a good job amending your soil with compost and other organics, you could probably get away with a vegetable and tomato specific fertilizer, something like this, that is once again a little bit higher in the phosphorus and a little bit lower in the nitrogen and potassium. I personally am partial to a good balanced fertilizer, something like a 10-10-10 at this point, just to make sure that I'm covering all of my bases. I'm not going to wade into the debate around synthetic versus organic today, but I will say I have a video on how to quickly look up how much of the good stuff, like your NPK, and how much of the bad stuff like lead and cadmium and arsenic is in your fertilizer, and I'll link to that video in the description. All right, let's circle back to why we didn't add a concentrated fertilizer when we were preparing our soil ahead of time. It's important to know that tomato plants actually take up the minority of their nitrogen earlier in their life cycle before they start setting fruit. The majority of that growth and the nitrogen uptake is kind of between that early fruit set and then when that fruit starts ripening. And for that reason, the nitrogen that you put into the soil kind of needs to stay in and around the roots for a long time to provide the plant with the nitrogen when it actually needs it. So applying those fertilizers way ahead of time, right, when you're preparing that soil can be kind of inefficient. So generally speaking, applying those fertilizers at the time of transplant is more efficient. Therefore, adding a lot of your organics like your compost and your manure at the point where you're preparing the soil, and then a moderate nitrogen fertilizer when you're transplanting in the young seedling, the young plant, and then adding some mild nitrogen fertilizers throughout the growing season is a pretty effective and efficient fertilization schedule that's going to grow healthy plants and also prevent a lot of wasted fertilizer. And the reason we want that high phosphorus fertilizer early in the season at that time of transplant is because phosphorus supply is most limiting early in the season when the root system is still small and the soil is cold. On the flip side, potassium uptake and requirements are going to be low until that fruit set. And in fact, the potassium requirements for that plant is really probably going to be met by just what's already in the soil. That said, I think for most of us, home gardeners, homesteaders, we're not going to go out and make or buy a zero potassium fertilizer. So I wouldn't worry about it too much. Use that balanced fertilizer knowing that that potassium is probably not going to be used until a little bit later in the season. In any case, make sure that you are not overdoing it with the fertilizer. It is totally possible to damage the plant and its root system by over-fertilizing. So make sure that you are looking at the bag's instructions and you are following them, or maybe even doing a little bit less, diluting that fertilizer a little bit. It is particularly important to watch how much you're using if you're using a really strong synthetic, something like a 16-16-16, which is still a popular option. Assuming you are transplanting in already started tomato plants 12-18 inches and you're not starting your tomato seeds in the ground, you can go ahead and either mix that fertilizer directly into the planting hole or offset it a little bit to the side of the plant, and that way the roots, as they grow out of that root ball, will be able to reach the nutrients. You've probably heard that tomatoes have very deep root systems, and that's true. They can actually grow deeper than 3 feet, but it's important to know that the vast majority of those roots, and therefore where the plant is getting the majority of its nutrients, are in that top 18 inches of soil. Before we get into the details of fertilizing this plant, I do want to say that if you mix in a lot of organics at the point where you were preparing your soil and you added a balanced fertilizer when you're transplanting in your plant, you're probably going to get a harvest at that point, particularly if you are growing a faster growing determinate plant. So, kudos for getting to that point. But for the best harvest, and certainly the best harvest with larger indeterminate plants like this cherry tomato plant, I like to periodically side dress my plants with supplemental fertilizers. Now, I like to time my first side dressing of fertilizer to coincide with the point where I start to let the plant flower and fruit, usually about 4 to 6 weeks after transplant. Go ahead and ignore the fact that this plant is way ahead of that point. We're just using it as a demo plant today. At this point in the plant's life cycle, I want to make sure that the plant has potassium available first and foremost and nitrogen second. And actually too much nitrogen is going to be counterproductive because I'm just going to have to manage all that foliage growth through aggressive pruning anyways. Probably phosphorus levels have not been depleted at this point, but it's okay that it's going to be present in our mix. As always, we've got to find that balance between practical and being perfectly optimal. So for side dressing these more mature plants that are starting to flower and set fruit, my fertilizer of choice is still a dry granular option, but we've gone ahead and we have transitioned to a vegetable and tomato specific variety that is a little bit lower in nitrogen and a little bit higher in phosphorus and potassium. I think granular fertilizer is a good choice for a home gardener or a homesteader because it is easy to apply, it's cost effective, right? You can buy it in large quantities even if you're going for an organic option. You don't have to apply it as often as something like a liquid fertilizer, and it's just dead simple to use. Liquid fertilizers can be great for market gardeners, farmers who have automated applicators on their side, but I think they're a little bit more challenging, a little bit more fiddly for the standard home gardener, standard homesteader. On a similar note, I don't use any foliar fertilizers, right? The sort of thing that you spray directly onto the leaves because I just don't think they're necessary in most home settings, right? It's pretty easy for most of us who are either hand watering or using irrigation to just side dress our tomato plants with fertilizer. We don't have some of the constraints that might make a foliar fertilizer that can be applied sort of laterally or from above beneficial. To side dress our more mature plants here, I'm just going to create a small furrow row about 4 to 6 inches away from the plant stem. Now, this organic fertilizer here is pretty mild stuff, and I'm not too worried about it damaging the plant. If I was using a stronger synthetic, I would be a little bit more careful about my placement. This is one of the few times that lots of mulch can be a pain to deal with, but just do your best to get at the soil line. I'm then going to sprinkle in either the recommended quantity of granular fertilizer or, more often, a reduced amount, less than the recommended amount. Then I'm just going to bury it in a bit. After that, it's just a matter of fixing up our mulch layer and then watering in all that fertilizer. Hey, if you're kind of short on time or maybe a little bit of patience here, I also really like these spike fertilizers. They are super easy to use. They're slow release, so they'll kind of release over a longer period of time. And I've gotten really, really good results with them, actually. They work fantastically in my experience. So we're going to go ahead and plop one in for this little tomato plant that is a little behind. Give it a kind of boost here. And we're done. Hard day's work complete. Keep in mind that nutrient uptake is really going to slow in the last month before harvest, with the fruit really primarily taking its nutrients out of the vine itself. So if you were growing a determinate plant with only one big flush of fruit, you may only need to side dress one more time depending on the timing of your initial feeding. In our garden, we grow exclusively long season indeterminate plants, and our growing season is pretty long. I'm going to try and keep these alive into late September, even early October. And I like to time it so that I'm feeding them every 4 to 6 weeks, which means I've probably got another 4 to 5 feedings to go on these plants. Good thing that we are using a affordable granular fertilizer. I really hope this kind of content helps you grow a killer tomato garden this year. If it is the kind of thing that you're interested in and you're digging it, please consider subscribing to the channel. It really helps me out. All right, let's get back to the plant food talk. Okay, what about all those fun DIY amendments? Epsom salt and banana peels and coffee grounds and eggshells and all that good stuff. Truth is, we really don't use those unless you count adding just copious quantities of banana peels and coffee grounds to our compost back here. That stuff makes great soil, by the way. I'm just not that worried about micronutrient deficiencies and things like magnesium, considering all of the compost and worm castings and fertilizer that we use. Same deal with eggshells. The research at this point is fairly conclusive that things like blossom end rot is caused not by a deficiency of calcium in the actual soil, but a deficiency in the plant's ability to bring that calcium up and into the tissue due to a lack of water. And besides, the fertilizer that we use anyways has a lot of bone meal and therefore a ton of calcium. In case you're wondering, compost and worm compost can suffice on their own, both of them together, without any additional concentrated NPK fertilizers. In fact, that's all we're using on this tomato, pepper, marigold trio that we've got growing over here as kind of a bit of a fun test plant. I do, however, want to be honest and upfront about their limitations. You are probably going to give up some amount of yield by not using a concentrated fertilizer like the ones that we've been looking at today. I think that's okay. Certainly it's okay for me and a lot of my plants because I really like to control sort of how much I'm spending on the fertilizer, and I like to control the quality of my inputs, and that's pretty easy to do when you're making your own compost and your own worm compost. This year, I really want to ensure that all of my plants have all of the proper nutrients that they need, because most of my tomatoes are not back here in sort of the secluded container garden. They're out front where I planted them in a converted lawn space. And that converted lawn space is so new that the balance between predator insects and pest insects is really out of balance. It's out of whack, and it's skewed towards those pest insects, and there's a lot of pest pressure. In fact, you may have noticed on some of these plants that there's little discolorations, little light spots, and that's from whiteflies. We have a lot of whiteflies. And the reality is that a plant that has plenty of all of those major nutrients and macronutrients is going to be much better able to fight off that pest and disease pressure than a plant that is sort of struggling to get what it needs. If you're setting up a brand new garden as well and you're worried about those same kind of imbalances, just keep that in mind. You may want to use more fertilizer or more aggressive fertilization strategy that first year or those first 2 years, and then maybe taper off as that garden becomes a little bit more established and a little bit more balanced. By the way, we fertilize all of our container tomatoes almost the exact same way we fertilize our in-ground tomatoes. I just use maybe 1/3 to 50% less for the container tomatoes. Tomatoes are just such a popular plant in a vegetable garden. It's inevitable there are going to be hundreds or even thousands of growing strategies out there. To keep myself honest, I've really tried in this video to stick to university-backed research, and I will definitely include links to all of those resources that I used in the description. That said, I did use quite a bit of anecdotal information from my personal experience growing tomatoes. So just keep in mind that we have a hot, dry climate. We have a very long season. We're growing primarily heirloom indeterminate tomatoes that are maybe a little little bit more finicky than a modern hybrid. If you are someone who is growing in a short season, perhaps you have higher levels of humidity, perhaps you are growing determinants, perhaps you're growing modern hybrid plants, just keep in mind that you may want to tailor some of this information for your particular context. And that's all I've got for you today. Happy gardening, and I will see you on the next one.